Okay, thank you.
So, Mark,
Nice, Jack.
I can tell you God. You love God.
What?
You love God. Right?
Yes. Yes.
We agree on that.
Are you asking for my testimony? Because I'm not going to. This is not the place, John.
You want to get, because you love God, you're looking for a way of getting God into the explanation of certain relationship. And this is sort of in a way going back to Peter's question with regard to the Aristotelian natural law thing. The way it seems, the way you want to say, okay, if I'm going to get God into the explanation, I have to find something for God to explain. And what I find there in the natural law, the Aristotelian natural law account that needs to be explained is let's say that there might be a potential gap between specifying what something is, say the human, and what's good for that thing.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of nice that there's this potential gap because then God can close that gap, as it were.
Yeah.
But suppose the Aristotelian were to say, well, but there is no gap there. That is, when we're at the level of the moral, specifying what's good for X is really nothing other than telling us what X is.
Yeah.
And so that there's no more gap between and so you don't have to give account of the validity of what's good for X, but for God, because it's like talking about the relationship between A and B when you say A equals B.
Yeah.
There's no gap there to be explained. The only thing that really needs to be explained is why is A there?
Yeah.
And it seems to me, in a sense, I don't know if Peter would agree, but that's sort of what he's trying to get at there, and that is, there's no gap there for the Aristotelian. And so why wouldn't it be sufficient for the Aristotelian natural law theorists just to say, well, what explains A equals B is that A is there?
Yeah, that's very smart. Yeah, that's very smart. I mean, so yeah, and I don't know exactly what to say about it. I mean, one thing, so there are a couple things that one might do, right? So one thing I can do at this point is start poking away at the Aristotelian story, right? Is start asking about, well, okay, so you characterize, right, a thing's good, right, in terms of characteristic activity and so forth, and you give an analysis of that, and I can say, well, look, it seems to me, for example, right, I defend an account of a thing as good in terms of characteristic activity and function and so forth. And interestingly enough, again, this is not part of my aim because I didn't want it to be essentially theistic when I was doing this stuff. It turns out that there's this sort of unexplained value notion hanging around, right? That doesn't seem to be in any way accounted for by my theory of a creature's good, right? And you could say, well, you could just say, well, there's nothing more to be explained there. That should say, well, it looks like there's something to explain there. It looks like some sort of value notion that this is the sort of thing that you might want to give a further accounting of. And I say, well, lucky for me, right? Since I defend this, it looks like there is this little gap here, in the way that I think about it, that provides room for the explanation to go in. There's this other thing that I don't know what to say about this. So I wonder whether or not there are certain sorts of how do I put this? I wouldn't want to say this about everything, of course, but maybe that certain sorts of failure to be lacking gaps. What's that all about? I mean, there's certain kinds of explanation in which lacking a gap, right, counts against it from a theistic point of view, right? It could very well be that that if theism is true, there are certain places where we should expect gaps, and it counts against a theory, right, that there's no gap there, right? Now, look, someone might say, well, look, I'm a theist and I'm an Aristotelian, right? My view, right, there are no gaps to be explained. Therefore, right, theism must be okay, right, with this view because, after all, we can't require God to explain what's unexplainable, right? And I say, well, actually, maybe you should reconsider your view of what's unexplainable, right? Maybe you should take it to be the case that something like this, right, has gaps that otherwise you wouldn't accept if you were a theist. There are no follow-ups allowed, John. Sorry.
Your example is what the natural law theorist doesn't account for is why it's good to have knowledge for a creature capable of knowledge.
Yeah.
But then you might ask, well, why should we expect it for theists that there would be a gap there? Right? I mean, it seems to me the Aristotelian is going to say something like, what would it be for something to be capable of X as a matter of its nature?
Yeah.
and it not be good to have X.
Yeah. Well,
Why should the theist expect a gap there as opposed to somewhere else?
Well, so one thing I can say is that the mere fact that it's necessarily true that a being with this nature, this would be good for it, doesn't show that there's no explanatory gap, right? That's unless it's like it, right? Fine. And I can say, well, and again, I guess at that point, I put these forward as distinct responses, but maybe it turns out that I can't have them as distinct responses, right? I want to say, well, start now telling me, right, about what's sufficient for a thing to be a member of this kind, right, with this good, and tell me whether you can give me the story in non-theistic terms, right? So if it turns out that something structurally identical to John O'Callaghan comes crawling out of the swamp, right, produced by some weird, is this a being for whom knowledge is the good, right, for whom is part of the good and so forth, right? I actually think probably not. I think that sort of mere fact isn't sufficient for you to place us, not you, but the thing, right? In our kind, right? And it may very well be that typically, if you want to talk about sort of what makes something have a certain characteristic activity belong to a kind, you need some sort of, the best stories are kinds of causal stories with kinds, right? You say, well, it tends toward this end because, right? Because engaging these activities makes it tend toward those ends, right? And it may very well be that that's the sort of story that the best version of is a theistic story, and it may be that any sort of non-theistic story is going to be kind of just mysterious, right? The notion of form or kind might be much. A lot of people think this sort of Aristotelian account of form or kind, right, is much weirder for non-theists than it is for theists. Anyway. On the way over here today, I think I passed you in the car. You're Dan?
Yeah.
Dan?
Right, Dan.
Yeah. Yes, Dan. I just wanted to know that that's your name. Yeah.
I'm trying to get at the distinction between what you call the natural law view and your own view. And first,
My view's better. That's the one thing. Yeah.
I agree.
Oh, good. Excellent.
I agree.
Perfect.
What I'm wondering is if I didn't understand why you're supposed to the natural law view, and so I thought maybe this is the difference. Is what you're calling the natural law view the new natural law view, and yours is the old natural law view?
Yeah. No, that's really funny. So yeah, good one. Zing. So look. I mean, this is one thing I sort of puzzled over, right? Sort of is I say, well, and in some places I'm describing standard natural law view, and I'm describing Aquinas' view, right? And then later I'm using Aquinas to sort of point out that we get some of these ideas present, right? It's great. So when I talk about sort of what the standard natural law view is, I guess I should name some names here, right? So some of these are what I call the new natural law theorists, right? People like Finis and Grisey and people kind of like me, right? But also some folks who take themselves to be being sort of more faithful to Aquinas, right, in terms of their account of grounding natural law in human nature. It's sort of a much more, I don't know the best way, much more straightforward way or less sort of roundabout way. Folks like Anthony Liska, right? Anthony? Yes, that's right. Yeah, Liska. Anyway, so he's not a new natural law theorist by any stretch of the imagination, right? But on his characterization, right? The view that I described would fit that as well as would fit. The characterization I gave would fit Liska's view as well as these other people that are called sort of new natural law theorists. Now, whether or not the view that I've described as standard natural law theory is in fact Aquinas' view, I think is kind of an open question, right? It strikes me that Aquinas has a lot of things that sound sort of very strongly Aristotelian, but on the other hand, you get these remarks about participation in the divine goodness and so forth that sounds, like there's that sort of wee bit of Platonism, right? It strikes me that should be part of every theistic view. And you've got to have some of it, right? If you think that there's such a thing as, if you think that God is the good, right? It seems that commits every theist to just a little bit of Platonism, right? And when they characterize it. So no, I don't think, when I describe the standard, I don't think it's just these sort of new natural law theorists. I think there's an open question about whether the standard view is Aquinas' view. I think that the resources for this, I think a more adequate view, I think you can get out of Aquinas' text, but I don't know. I hesitate to ascribe either view so straightforwardly to Aquinas. Thanks, though. Thanks for making me clarify that.
Caleb? Yeah. So it seems like one of the reasons that theists might be interested in the relationship between God and moral law is because she wants to make sense of the continuous religious commitments she has. So she's thinking of the injunction like to turn the other cheek
Yeah.
And she wants to know if she has a good reason for like giving a slightly different account than somebody like Scanlon might give. And it seems like it'd be nice if the account you gave of the general relationship between God and the moral law was such that it just sort of fell out from that general account. Sort of more particular religious whatevers. But it's not clear to me that your account is one where those things fall out. So do you think if that's the case, is it a liability of your view that you can't give a unified?
My view has no liabilities. No. So, Caleb, I mean, I think there's kind of a prior question to be answered before we can decide sort of whether or not this is a liability from my view, is that I think you need to have some stance on sort of what part of Christian morality is what you might call natural morality, and what part of Christian morality is what you might call sort of superadded or is, in some sense additional or beyond or, on top of, right? So for example, right, if you're told to turn the other cheek, right, or to love your neighbor as yourself, right, in that sort of strong form, is what's happening there, right, is this simply a repeating with great vigor from someone we have good reason to take to be, to know what's morally required, right? Is that what's going on? Just sort of an authoritative, a theoretically authoritative passing along of what's already morally required? Or is it the case that what's happening, there are other more nuanced views, but or is it the case that what's happening is that Christians are called to a way of life that's not required by natural morality, but is in some sense, at least in some specific ways, favored by it, right? And which God calls us to, right, as Christians. Okay. Now, if it's the former, right, then I would hope that I would need either an account of divine likeness or an account of specific natural law view, right, that would generate the requirements that are part of Christian ethics in this sense. But if these sorts of commands, right, like love your neighbor as yourself or turn the other cheek, which I sort of have my doubts about sort of whether this is part of natural morality or not. Okay, I'm uncertain about it, right? If it's the case that these belong to not natural morality, right, but something that's given to us over and above, right, as Christians, a specific kind of a vocation that's the Christian vocation rather than some specific person's vocation, right, then it would be a liability in my view if it actually entailed it, right? Because what that would mean is, right, that all that Christ is doing is coming along and passing along the same, what's true already, right, but just, giving us more reason to believe it, right? It may, if what's going on is giving a new commandment, right, something that's adding, right, or making more specific, right, the moral norms that we're called to, then my view shouldn't entail it. I mean, I don't want a view that entails. I want a view that leaves it open, right? It makes it possible for God to authoritatively command it, but rather than one that already entails this is part of sort of the moral landscape for us. Thanks.
What about particular commands to particular people, which the divine command appears to readily accommodate?
Yeah.
To use a really bad example, Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, or less controversially, Paul's command, say, to be a missionary to the Gentiles, or such things as that. Does your view then need something like the counterpart of a miracle with the natural law analogy? Yeah. If you're going to accommodate God commanding these things?
See, yeah. So it really isn't an essential to your example that it's the Isaac and Abraham case, right? So I mean, if you're simply talking about commands to specific people, right, that aren't sort of generally part of the natural moral law, then my view can accommodate it sort of or a view like mine can accommodate it, so long as you think that obedience to God is part of natural morality, that sort of it's part of our nature as humans that we owe, right, that we owe obedience, right, to God as our Creator. And so, what if God, gives us commands? If God gives us commands, specific commands, that we're bound to act in accordance with them. I said that's all fine. Just my view requires that this isn't the sort of the basic story about what's morally required of us. It's not the full story or anything like that. I do think, though, and I think this is a hard problem. I don't have any good story about it. So, look, one of the things that motivates, one of the things that really motivates occasionalists, right, about the laws of nature, are miracles, right? So you say, so the fire, they were actually in real fire, right? Rack, Shack, and Benny, we're in the fire. Okay, parents don't have Veggie Tales, right? They're in the fire, right? Real fire, and it didn't burn them at all. How can that be possible? And the occasionalists say, well, look, there's no real mystery here, right? I mean, God generally intends, right, that in the occasion of in the presence of fire, things burn. But if God, wants to change things up a bit, that's all right. God, can leave it. Can have that sort of freedom. So miracles become much easier to explain. Probably too easy to explain, but that's sort of what motivates this, right? But here, and you might say, well, look, isn't it true that theological voluntarists can make the same sort of move in explaining moral miracles, right? So you have cases where it looks like something that's customary, or not customary is the wrong word, that we would take to be morally wrong, right? Just because of the natures of the things involved, right? It'd be wrong to sacrifice your son, right? Your innocent son whom you love, right? That'd be the wrong thing to do. But somehow, in virtue of some divine intervention, it makes it possible for it to be morally okay, right? I think, and again, you can say, the great thing about theological voluntarism is it answers that easily, right? It says, oh, yeah, all these things are morally required or not by an act of divine will. If you're given divine dispensation, there's no problem, okay? It's perfectly okay for you to do. Again, it solves the problem, in my view, too easily. It makes it too, unmysterious, right? Why this is such a hard case, morally speaking. I should say, the concurrentist, the law of nature concurrentist, right, has a great story about fiery furnaces and people not burning up. God fails to concur, right? God withholds God's concurrence, and so the fire, even though it keeps the same nature, doesn't burn the thing. I can't use that maneuver, right, as a moral concurrence, because I think this is all necessary, right? I think that God's granting moral status to some action is not the result of some free action on God's part. It's simply the result of God's being the good. So I need some other story about these sorts of moral miracles, and I don't have one. I mean, when Aquinas gives an example, he doesn't just doesn't go like that. He gives an account in terms of all life belongs to God, and so there's a kind of divine dispensation that's sort of understandable within natural morality, right? So it's contrary to ordinary morality, but not in any sense of violation. It's not miraculous in the way that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thing is, right? But I said I don't have any sort of well-developed story on that. I think it's a really good question what to do about it.
We have a reception outside that Joyce Zarowski has put together, which you all can enjoy. If you see her, you can stop and thank her, and now we can thank our speaker.